Good evening, folks. How's everybody doing this evening? Good. Thank you so much for joining us at tonight's Cafe Sci. My name is Sarah Grummett, and as always, I'm excited to be your host for the evening. Cafe Sci is presented by PPG. It's also supported by wonderful folks like yourself. Thank you to everyone who donates to support this program. If you're unable to donate but would like to support Cafe Sci, the most helpful thing you can do, as always, is to invite your friends to join us in the audience. Cafe Sci takes place typically on the first Monday of each month. Tonight's is an exception, and you can register for next month's Cafe Sci speaker at carnegiesciencecenter.org. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I'll just remind everybody that there is a Q&A after the talk. For our on-site audience, please raise your hand, and we will bring a microphone around to you. For our online audiences, you can ask your questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can enter your questions at any time during the presentation, but we are going to be holding all questions until the end. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Howard Whiteman. Let's give him a round of applause. So Dr. Howard Whiteman is Commonwealth Endowed Chair of Environmental Studies, Director of the Watershed Studies Institute, and a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Murray State University in Murray, Kentucky. Dr. Whiteman studies evolutionary ecology and conservation biology and has conducted field and experimental research for over 3 decades. A native of West Mifflin and a graduate of Allegheny College, he writes a biweekly column about science and the environment for 5 newspapers, including Pittsburgh's own Valley Mirror. Let's give another warm welcome to Dr. Howard Whiteman.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? It's an honor to be here at Cafe Sci, and I'm really glad to thank you all for coming, and those of you that are online, thank you for coming as well. I'd like to start today by showing our planet that we live on and giving us some perspective, because I think it's really easy for us to forget that we're living on a planet that's in a solar system that's in the Milky Way galaxy, which is one galaxy in the known universe, and we're like this tiny little speck. And that Earth, that life support system that we have, looks really idyllic when you look at it during the day and you see how blue it is and how wonderful and how much life is there. And when we look at night, we can sort of see the human imprint and the footprint that we've had on the Earth. And that footprint is even greater than we think, because recently it's been estimated that we've created more technomass than the actual biomass of living things that are out there. So if you add up sort of the different kinds of things that we've created, like concrete and brick and plastics, they add up to more than all the living things on the planet. Even plastics itself is more than the biomass of all the animals on the planet. And in some ways, that's sort of like, someone might raise a flag and say, that's a great thing, because that shows humans are so wonderful. We've done all these great things. We've created all this stuff. But there's been a cost to that. And as many of you are well aware, the temperature has increased on the planet, and we have climate change effects. So this shows the temperature increase over time, and the average temperature above pre-industrial levels. And you can see that in 2024, we surpassed 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the limit that we were trying to keep from with the Paris Accords. Those of you that are familiar with those treaties that we signed, that's what we didn't want to get to, and we've already sort of burned past it. That temperature surge has effects on our planet that you're very well aware of. The increase in the wildfires, the droughts, the increasing ocean temperatures that affects the strength of storms. And so now is a time that we need places like the Carnegie Science Center, really. We need research and education to help us solve our environmental problems, now more than ever. And we also need that research and education to understand and respond to our changing environment that's changing all around us. And that's true for human health concerns, for our food systems, for our freshwater resources, and also for understanding the effects on the other living things that are out there on the planet, sharing the planet with us. And today I'm going to talk about this 4th box. I'm not going to be talking about polar bears, actually, but although that would be fun. But I am going to talk about wildlife, and in this wildlife will be some salamanders. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how climate changes have been affecting them. and give you some insight into the 35 years or so that I've been studying these salamanders in Colorado through field research, and also the experimental work that we've done. So you may not understand what these figures are right now, but by the end of the talk, I promise you will. And so to cut to the chase, like, what are the salamanders saying? Well, they're saying, we have a bunch of data to talk to you about, and we're going to give you some results, conclusions, and maybe talk about the implications of what humans can do about it. So to start off, I just want to talk about, like, why amphibians? Why would we ever want to study amphibians? Why would I used to be asked this by my mom all the time. And one reason is that they're really cool. They just are. So this is me in the 1970s, and I'm with my dad, and I'm at my grandfather's cabin up in Cameron County. My grandfather and I went down to a beaver pond and filled that bottle, that orange juice bottle, with eastern newts, these guys. And I was fascinated by those newts. They were swimming through this pond, and somehow my grandfather had a little dip net or something, and we were catching them. We put them in the bottle. We brought them home. My mom wouldn't let me keep them in the house. So I went into an aquarium underneath the eaves of the house, and I went out to them every day and checked them out and was watching them, trying to figure out what was going on. I just thought they were cool. Like, they're really neat. And I didn't ever think that I was going to be studying salamanders my entire life. I really, like, when you're that age, it's not happening. Like, it went away. Like, it went away for a while, and somehow I came back. But they're really cool. They really are cool. But that's probably not enough. I mean, that's enough for me, but that's probably not enough for most people. So when we ask why amphibians, one of the reasons is that they're actually canaries. They're really good canaries. So we used canaries through the 1980s as a way of telling whether there was toxic gas in mines. And if the canary went bad, then we knew to get out. And amphibians are the same way. They're an early warning indicator of what's happening in our environment. And they are, in part, because they have permeable membranes. These are embryos on the left, and those embryos are just exposed to everything. There's just water can get in, chemicals can get in. They have permeable membranes. The larvae have permeable membranes as well, and even the adults, compared to other organisms, just they're like, I think of them as sort of like being sponges with vertebrae. I mean, they just suck up everything. And because that they spend part of their time in water and part on land, we also say they have double jeopardy, because they get exposed to things in the air, in the soil, and in the water. And finally, if you think about those eggs end up being larvae, the larvae end up being adults make more eggs. They have what's called a complex life cycle. And that means that we can use different parts of the life cycle to tell us and to really narrow down the kinds of negative effects that are being imparted on these animals, the stressors that they're feeling. Are they affecting one part of the life cycle or not? Now, to talk about the animals that I work on, we have to focus on this life cycle for a second. And I need to tell you a little bit about amphibian life cycles, because the one I study is even more complex than the usual one. You're all familiar with human life cycles, right? Humans get together, they produce sperm and eggs, they produce a baby, that baby grows, becomes an adolescent, and hopefully transforms into something called an adult. That's just, we have the same kind of life cycle, it just looks different. And I'm sure you're familiar with amphibian, like frog life cycles, because frogs mate, they produce eggs, the eggs hatch and have embryos, the embryos hatch into what's called a tadpole. The tadpole metamorphoses into, and might be like adolescence, right? That's their metamorphosing while they're in their teens. And then those metamorphic individuals become adults. The thing about bullfrogs and leopard frogs and American toads, all these kinds of species of frogs, is that they don't have a choice but to metamorphose. That's what they always do. They can't finish their life cycle unless they become a metamorphic individual. And so we call it obligate metamorphosis. Like, they have to do it. They're obligated to metamorphose to complete their life cycle. Salamanders do the same thing. They have adults that produce eggs, larvae. The larvae get bigger and bigger, and then they metamorphose into the adults. And that, again, is obligate metamorphosis. But in some salamanders, there's other life cycles that occur. Two other ones that both deal with pedomorphosis. And this, I'm trying not to put too many crazy terms in today, but pedo means juvenile. And so these are organisms that have juvenile features. They retain those features. And in salamanders, that means that they're sexually mature, but they have a larval form. So they look like larvae, but they're sexually mature adults. And you know some pedomorphic salamanders already, I'm sure of it. You probably know what an axolotl is, or you've heard of it. Maybe you've seen them in pet trade, maybe you've seen them on Minecraft, you've seen them in other things. There are axolotls. They have these juvenile traits. They have gills, and they're sexually mature. Alpine newts are related to my eastern newts, but they live in Europe. They also have these pedomorphic traits. Sirens, greater sirens and lesser sirens, both have these gills sticking out. They have a long fleshy tail, and these are even better because they only have front limbs. They don't have rear limbs. So they're extremely pedomorphic. And some of you are probably familiar with our state amphibian in Pennsylvania, the hellbender. Hellbenders are pedomorphic. They live their entire lives in water. They're completely aquatic, have a big fleshy tail, and they sort of signify pedomorphic individuals. So how do we get a pedomorphic individual from an obligately metamorphic life cycle? Well, first of all, we take that guy out and let him disappear, and then we just add a really big larva. These larvae they don't metamorphose, they just become really big pedomorphic forms. And when they do that, the way a siren does, an axolotl, or a hellbender, then they're called obligately pedomorphic because they don't have a choice. That's how their life cycle completes. Hellbenders never metamorphose. Sirens never metamorphose. Axolotls are not supposed to metamorphose. So that's one other life cycle. The one I study is a little bit different of that. It's actually where both morphs coexist. So you've got metamorphic forms that go through metamorphosis. You've got pedomorphic forms that don't metamorphose, and they go together and they can interbreed to produce the next generation. And because it's not obligate, it's called facultative, because it turns out it depends on something as to whether they become one morph or another. And that something is what makes them so unique and makes them so interesting to study in terms of things like climate change, because becoming a pedomorph depends on the environment. If I take a larva and I expose it to different environments, I can produce one of those two morphs, the pedomorph or the metamorph. And it depends on what environment you put them in, and it also depends on their genes. So some individuals are genetically predisposed to become pedomorphic. They're more likely to go. Some are individually more likely to become metamorphic, but you can take either of those individuals and put them in a different environment and make them go the other way. That's how plastic they are. And so the fact that these individuals have these two different forms that are environmentally induced, and the fact that the environment is changing, means that these are potentially really good canaries, not just average everyday amphibian canaries. They're really good canaries for understanding questions about environmental change. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about two different places and two different species that I've been studying. And I'm going to spend most of my time in Colorado at this red dot right here. And I work in Colorado at a place called the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, and I study a species called the Arizona tiger salamander. And this is my field research that I do in the summer, and this is the majority of what I'm going to be speaking about today. But I'm also going to tell you about the other red dot, which is in western Kentucky. And this is work that I've been doing with some of my colleagues at the Hancock Biological Station, which is Murray State's field station. And there I've been studying a different species of salamander called the mole salamander. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But those studies have given us context for understanding what's happening in the Colorado study. So, take a quick drink. Let's talk about these animals here. The Arizona tiger salamander, the Latin name is Ambystoma mavortium nebulosum, is facultatively pedomorphic. So these guys on the top are the metamorphic adults. They've lost their gills. Their skin changes to a more terrestrial one, and they crawl out on land. The individuals below are the pedomorphic adults. They have gills, long fleshy tail, looks like a big overgrown larvae, but they're sexually mature, and these individuals can come back and interbreed with each other. I study these salamanders in a place called the Mexican Cut Nature Preserve, which is owned by the Nature Conservancy, and it's administered by the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, and it's found in the Elk Mountains of south central Colorado. And Mexican Cut is ideal for my research for a couple different reasons. One is that it's relatively isolated within these mountains. So you can sort of see here, there's two shelves of ponds. The ponds in the foreground are the upper Mexican cut, and the ponds below are the lower Mexican cut. And beyond those two shelves, there aren't ponds for a long distance. And so that means, from an ecological point of view, that this provides a nice closed system for me to study a salamander population. I don't have to worry about salamanders getting in or out or escaping me. You know, I can really work on what's there. The other reason that it's really good for my research is that this is what it looks like in July, but in June it'll look something like this. It'll still be completely frozen. These ponds are at 12,000 feet, and this is the second highest population of salamanders in the world, to the best of my knowledge. Somebody can write a question in and tell me I'm wrong. So that means that sometimes the ponds are melted out in mid-June. Sometimes it's May, but mostly it's mid-June. Sometimes not until after the 4th of July. And that has a couple implications. One is that for an academic like myself, I can roll out of final exam week and have a couple weeks before I have to really worry about going to Colorado, which is really cool, really nice for me, very convenient. Secondly, it really influences what happens with these salamanders, because you think about it, if they don't melt out until July, and they're starting to close up again in October and November, these animals have a really short growing season, and they've got to reproduce, they've got to grow, they've got to eat, they've got to put on fat stores for the winter. They have to do all that stuff in a really short, constrained time. And it turns out that that has a huge influence on what their life cycle is like and what their life history is like in these ponds. And I'll just show you what I mean. If you think about the life cycle that I've shown you before, it's a little bit different at Mexican Cut. The embryos hatch into hatchlings. And if you were around here in Pennsylvania, or even at lower elevation in Colorado, those hatchlings could metamorphose in their first summer. They'd get big enough. They'd have enough time. They'd have more energy, more food available for them. It never happens at Mexican Cut. Instead, they have to overwinter into their second summer of larval development. At the end of the second summer, a few of them are big enough that they metamorphose. But most of them, the majority of the animals, overwinter to their third summer of larval development. And that, at the end of the third summer, they can metamorphose or become sexually mature pedomorphs. Sometimes they don't become mature right away. It takes a while, but if they haven't metamorphosed at the end of the third summer, they're really on a pedomorph track. And then those individuals can go back and form the next generation. And so this constrained growth season lengthens the larval period from just a few months to over 3 summers. And that, it turns out, influences a lot of the other things that are going on in terms of who becomes a pedomorph and what the consequences are of being one morph or another. So we catch these animals using long-handled dip nets. The ponds at Mexican Cut are very nutrient poor because they're on top of a mountain, and so they're very crystal clear. So you can basically hunt salamanders all summer, which is another real perk of my job. We use the sort of really fine aquarium nets so that we don't harm the animals. We're trying to maintain the population. We also don't want to negatively influence a nature preserve. So we're very careful about how we move around the nature preserve, what we do, all those sorts of things. We take the animals back to our field tent, even during COVID, and we take a variety of data on these animals, including what morph they are, what sex they are they in breeding condition, how big, what's their body condition, and then we mark individuals with unique PIT tags. So PIT stands for Passive Integrated Transponder. Some of you might have a microchip in your dog or your cat. These are the same microchips we put in the salamanders. And so the salamanders come in, we can scan them like groceries, we can throw the data into the database and see the entire history of that animal in real time while we're sitting up there on the top of the mountain, which is tremendous, really. And if you do that over a long enough expanse of time, you get this long-term lifetime data. So we've been studying these animals since 1988, and I've been marking them since 1990. And in that time, we have over 39,000 captures, and of those, over 7,000 individuals are of known age. In other words, I marked them when they were second-year larvae. I knew what cohort or age class they were, and so I could follow them during their entire lifespan. So what that gives you is that it allows us to measure life history traits of these animals and to compare metamorphs and pedomorphs across the entire lifespan for lots of different adults. Not everyone, but for lots of them. And so I want to give you a little perspective on the span of that research. one thing that has come about from studying them for so long is that you find out that they live a very long time. This is a distribution of one of the projects that we worked on, one of the data sets that we worked on. And it shows you the number of individuals as a function of longevity, how long they lived, how many years. And you see most animals die when they're in their first decade, but hundreds of animals live into their teens. And some individuals live into their 20s. But really, it turns out that you have to lengthen that x-axis, because the longest known individual we have is 34 years old. And this is what a 34-year-old salamander looks like. It doesn't look that different than a 9-year-old animal or a 15 or 22-year-old animal. They don't look that different. And we haven't caught them recently, but I'm really hopeful we catch them this summer so they're even older. I don't know. There's not a lot of them left. But these animals are the 1988 cohort, and I know that they are that old because I marked them in 1990, and I knew how old they were at the time. So I want to take a little break. It's still contextual for what we're talking about. I'm going to give you some non-random facts about 1988 when this animal was born. In 1988, the world population was 5.104 billion. Anybody know what the population is right now? Close. A little high. It's 8. It's 8, yes. So if you think about it, in the expanse of human history, to 1988, we created 5 billion people on the planet. And since 1988, we've added another 3 billion. Just to give you some context for what's happened since 1988. We had a President Ronald Reagan, and Bush beat Dukakis that year, for those of you that might remember back that far. A first-class stamp, I knew that would be important to someone, is 22 cents. Gas was $1.08 a gallon. CDs outsold vinyl for the first time. Does everyone remember what a CD was? Exactly. Beetlejuice, the first one was released. So that tells you how old Michael Keaton is. And NASA's James Hansen warned Congress of the dangers of global warming in 1988. So the same time that the 1988 cohort appeared at Mexican Cut, we were telling Congress that global warming was a real thing. And we're sort of still waiting, right? I'm just giving you perspective on it, right? It turns out the salamanders are not waiting, and I'll tell you why. So if we go back to this basic diagram, during my career, I have answered, or I've tried to answer, 4 different questions, many of which we're still working on. One of them is, how are the two morphs produced? That is, what are those environmental conditions that influence whether an individual goes one way or another? Secondly, once they are produced, how are they maintained? Why doesn't one morph drive the other to extinction? How do they maintain both morphs in the same population? What's going on there? Third, what are the ecological implications of producing the morphs? Like when you have more of one morph or another, does it affect things in the aquatic versus the terrestrial environment? And finally, what are the climate change implications of the morphs? How is climate change affecting them? And today, all I have time to talk about is this 4th question, but I'm going to touch on these first 2 questions, and I'd be glad to answer any questions about the 3rd question as well later on. So how has climate change affected these very different salamanders? We know they should be affected differently because if you think about it, metamorphs spend part of their time on land and part on water, whereas pedomorphs are stuck in the water. And water and land buffer temperature in completely different ways. And so they should have implications to both of them. And it turns out that climate change is affecting the Mexican Cut system. And in fact, it's faster there than lots of other places on the planet. This shows July mean daily minimum temperatures as a function of year, basically the expansive time that I've been studying them. And you see it's increased 3.4 degrees Celsius since 1988, which is 1.1 degrees Celsius per decade. And you remember how we were talking about the whole globe going over 1.5 degrees? These places are growing much faster. Compare that to the rest of the globe since 1988, 0.6 since 1988, 0.2 per decade. And also think about all the effects that have happened since 1988 with just that 0.6. So not only these great canaries, but these are great canaries that live in a place that is being affected, like lots of other high elevation sites and lots of high latitude sites, a lot more than the rest of the planet. It's an early warning site with an early warning species. Now, given all that, you would think that someone like me would have figured this out a long time ago. and that I would have thought about climate change much longer ago than I did. But I really didn't. It just, I knew about it, but I didn't really see anything. I didn't really see what's happening at the cut. I wasn't exploring it as much. Until I went to this pond one day. This is pond 52. It's in the upper cut, so it's the high elevation site, the high elevation sites of the high elevation site. And we were there because metamorphs will crawl up from the lower Mexican cut, they'll go to this pond and they'll feed there. And they do that because there's these great invertebrates called fairy shrimp that they just fill up on. They look really humongous at the end of the day. They're just chowing on them. So we go there and we catch the animals and we take them back down to our tent and we bring them back up. That's how we always did it for years. That day, one of my students said, hey, there's larvae over here. And I was like, no, there isn't, because, I'm the boss. I know better. We've never had larvae up there. That's not happening. That's my whole reality. It never happens. It's not going to happen. No, it was. There were second-year larvae. Remember I said they had to overwinter to their second summer? They were second-year larvae in this pond. And it turned out that, well, we measured them and we put pit tags in them and we let them go, and some of them come back. And we've been following them ever since. They're reproducing at this higher elevation site that they never did before. So let me give you perspective on that. This is a map of Mexican Cut, and this is the lower site where all the animals typically live and reproduce. And they've done that since at least the 1960s when people started studying them. Obviously, they were doing it a lot longer than that. And here's the upper cut, and there's 52. And we had no recruitment at all between 1990 and 2014. Nothing. And then in 2015, there were second-year larvae. In 2016, there were second-year larvae again. This past summer, we found hatchlings in 52 for the first time. Maybe there'll be second-year larvae again next year. So we went that whole expanse of time with no recruitment at higher elevations, and all of a sudden we have it. And so these animals, these metamorphs, are moving up to this pond and breeding at a higher elevation than before. But the pedomorphs are stuck in the lower elevation. There's no way to get a pedomorph at that elevation because they can't move. The only way to do it is if they were produced up there, and so far the conditions are not such that they'd be able to do that. So already we know that the morphs are being affected differentially by climate change in this system. But I want to give you a little bit different perspective on that. There's the lower cut. There's where they're moving to the upper cut. So they've been moving up in elevation like lots of other species, lots of other amphibians, mammals, birds, in the Rockies, in the Andes, the Sierra Nevadas. They've done the same thing. They're moving up in elevation. Some species are moving up in latitude as well. These are moving up in elevation. Above that, there's Galena Lake. It's on top of the mountain. It's super nutrient poor. There's nothing to eat in that lake. But that doesn't mean there won't be in 50 or 100 years. And the salamanders would have to cross either that cliff or a big talus slope. But I'm not going to put it past them to do that, okay? Maybe they'll make it up there. But then what? Then what? Are they going to grow wings? Are they going to go to SpaceX and get on this? What are you going to do? They're out of room. They run out of habitat, which is not unlike a lot of other species as well that are sort of being hurt by the climate because they can't go any further. So we knew that climate was affecting them. And at that point, I was like, okay, wake up. How are they being affected? Let's look at the data. We have all this long-term data. Let's look at the data and see what's happening and try to explore this a little bit. And thankfully, a lot of my collaborators are a lot smarter than me, do a lot more of the statistics for me, and we've collaborated on these questions. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that data. And the first set of questions I want to talk about is how it's affecting larval growth and these life history decisions to become one morph or another. And to do that, we go back to the life cycle, and just to say that those second-year larvae that become metamorphic, they're always in the best condition compared to everyone else. They're the good ones, right? The ones that are in poor condition in the second year tend to hang out for the third year, which is most individuals. At the end of the third summer, the good ones tend to metamorphose. There's some exceptions to that. Mostly that's the way it works. And then the poorer condition ones become pedomorphs. So that's important because those relationships have changed a little bit. And I'll show you how. But to show you, I want to talk about a couple different groups. So these are different cohort groups. So I'm going to group different cohorts together. And this is the years on the bottom, 1988. Those are the different cohorts through to 2016, the number of individuals. And you'll see that at the beginning, we have a cohort group of 1988 to 1990. And then 10 years later, we have 1998 to 2001. We got another big group. And then in 2008 to 2011, a smaller group, but still a significant number of individuals that we could study. And the thing about those individuals is they basically provide a natural experiment, because there's a 1-degree increase in 1998 compared to 88. And there's a 2-degree increase compared to 1988. So we basically are able to do an experiment to look at, okay, we know that air temperatures have changed. Is that changing anything in the animals over time? And one thing that it has changed is body condition of these animals, particularly in the pedomorphic individuals. Pedomorphs, after 1 degree Celsius, didn't change significantly. But after that 2 degrees, that final cohort that I can follow, they increased significantly. They're in a lot better condition. And those animals, you might remember, were the poor ones. They were in the poor condition animals. So before, the poorer condition animals were metamorphosing, and now all of a sudden, they're in a lot better condition. So what's happening? And it turns out that we're getting differences in the rates of metamorphosis. So this figure shows likelihood of metamorphosis as a function of the larval age. So you remember 2-year-olds can metamorphose, 3-year-olds can metamorphose. And you see that there's a high percentage that individuals are going to metamorphose at some point during the lifespan, and it goes down as they get older. But the older cohorts, the ones that are experiencing warmer temperatures, are much less likely to metamorphose. The pedomorphs are growing faster, and they're staying in the ponds. The ponds are becoming a better place to be for those animals, or so it seems. And you can also see it if we look back at this figure, because the gray bars are pedomorphs and the dark bars are metamorphs. And you see how the metamorphs are just petering out at the end. We're still having lots of pedomorphs, but in years when we would expect more metamorphs, we're just not getting them. So one thing that's happening is that these larval growth and body condition situations between the 2 morphs, those individuals are changing, and that's influencing who's metamorphosing and who's not. And we can tie that to climate change, because a colleague of mine, Dr. Mark Kirk, who's at Allegheny College, did these structural equation models. So I don't want to go crazy about the math here, because he's the guy who does it, I'm not. But structural equation models are basically glorified flowchart diagrams, right? You just think about the boxes, and then you have arrows that connect the boxes, and you create a much more complex version, and then you throw the data at it, and you figure out where are the significant influences that are occurring. What's affecting each other? And what he found was that there are 3 environmental variables, what are called lifetime growing degree days, which is the amount of time that they have that's ice-free. So remember we talked about they might not melt out until July. That's a short year. A long year would be in May. So if you have changes in that influences things. The snowpack influences things, because that influences whether the densities are there, the overwintering survival, and also the hydro period of the ponds. And then the third thing is cold spells, because that also influences overwintering survival. If you lose some animals in the winter, you have lower densities, the larvae grow better. And all those things affected relative body size. So SVL stands for snout to vent length, which is the way we measure the body size of these animals. And relative body size influences morph outcome, whether they become one morph or another. So we know that body sizes are changing over time. We know that the frequency of metamorphosis is going down, and we also know that climatic variables are really important in producing those results. Another question, that's one of those, that sort of first question, how are they produced? The second question has to do with their fitness. It's a good water break. And by fitness, I don't mean how many bench presses they can do or how many push-ups or sit-ups or anything. What I mean is their evolutionary fitness, right? What are the costs and benefits of being one morph or another? And one thing we're using to try to get at that is to figure out what their temperature is like. Like, what are the temperatures that these different animals are experiencing? And can that tell us anything about the fitness consequences that they're also experiencing? And this is work that I've been doing with Dr. Kelsey Ryder at James Madison University. And Kelsey and I have been implanting these data loggers. So that's not actual size. They're actually a little bit bigger than a fish oil pill. And so we surgically implant them in the animals. And we have to knock the animals out. We surgically implant them, sew them up, let them recover for a couple days, let them go. Then hopefully we catch them the next year, or the year after, or 3 years from now, whenever. then we bring them back in. We have to remove the data logger, pull it out, take the data out, sew them back up, let them recover, release them. And I know what you're all thinking. You killed a bunch of salamanders doing this. We haven't killed a single one, knock on wood. And we worked really hard. Kelsey is extremely meticulous about safety and thinking about the health of the animals, and it's been a pleasure to work with her. And we have certain criteria for who we pick so we don't mess up the long-term data set, and we also are very careful. We sort of practiced on axolotls beforehand, so we've done a lot of research to make sure it works. We've had animals come back. We've had animals released because we've taken the data loggers out, and the next year the scars are gone. Like, they're really hardy too. When you live on top of a mountain, I think you're just super hardy anyway, and so they dealt with it really well. So just to give you an idea of what those data look like, this is our rock star because it had 2.5 years of data, which was much longer than we thought we would ever get. And you see we caught it at the beginning in the summer, and it's fluctuating a lot on the left side because it's thermoregulating. It's warm, cold, warm, cold, warm. It's trying to get as warm as it can. But then as the fall comes, it's getting colder and colder, and it goes down almost to zero, maybe a little bit below. We're not really sure whether they go below zero and freeze or not yet. That's a work in progress. But then it pops right back up in the spring, and they go through the same thing, and they go down, and they're getting really cold, and then they pop up in the spring. So that's the cycle, and you can see how long that cold area is. That gives you an idea for what they're experiencing in the winter. The question is, what's happening? How do we compare those between the two morphs? Are there any differences? And it turns out that there are. In fact, there are 3 places that there are differences, 2 of which I can explain. One is in the summer, where pedomorphs are significantly warmer than metamorphs are. They're also significantly warmer in November, and I can't explain that yet, but I'm working on it. And then metamorphs are significantly warmer than pedomorphs in the winter. In the summer, it turns out that pedomorphs and larval forms generally, like non-mature larvae, right? They are really good at thermoregulating. At this high elevation, shallow areas in many of their ponds become really warm in the middle of the day. And so it's like clockwork. At 10 o'clock, they show up, they move in, they warm up, and then when it starts to turn, because 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 o'clock, the sun goes down, things start to shift. Those shallow waters start to get colder than the deep, and so they move out into the deep. They're really good at that. We've figured out that they can get within a ½ degree of the optimal temperature in those environments. So they're really using those thermal environments to maximize the temperatures that they're getting. Metamorphs can't do that. They're not as good at it, first of all. And they also don't hang out in those ponds that have the really good thermal resources. And most of the metamorphs are on land, where they can't really thermoregulate that much at all. So in the summer, it's definitely benefit towards the pedomorphs. In the winter, it's more about snowpack, because the pedomorphs are dug into the bottom of the pond, and those ponds freeze almost solid. So they're sitting right next to ice. But the metamorphs are like 18 to 24 inches underground, and they've got 8 to 12 feet of insulating snow above them. And it's not a really strong, high difference, but it's a significant difference. They're warmer. It's one of the reasons why mammals are able to overwinter at this elevation as well, because they're burrowed in underneath, and they have the snow to insulate them. Now, I thought, when I first saw that, because I'm not a physiological ecologist, I was like, oh, the metamorphs are doing better then, the pedomorphs are doing better in the summer. That's pretty cool. And then Kelsey was telling me that, no, actually, that's probably not a good thing for an ectotherm in the winter to be warmer. Like, you don't want, if you're warmer then you're metabolizing. So you really want to be colder. So the advantage is, in a sense, to the pedomorphs in the winter, because they're actually colder and they're not metabolizing when they shouldn't be. It's not like they can feed or anything at that time of year. So the question is, how will those relationships change over time? We've been putting them in for 5 or 6 years. We'd like to be able to get the funding to do it for 10 years and watch over the next degree of Celsius that we increase the air temperature. How does that change the relationships, the temperature that these animals are experiencing? And in part, we want to do that because we know that those internal temperatures might have a big impact on their evolutionary fitness. And we know that that evolutionary fitness is one of the things that's helping to maintain why we have those 2 morphs. And again, I don't have time to talk about the nitty-gritty of some of that, but we're basically talking about differences in their life history and different parameters that we can measure, like how long do they live? What's their age at first reproduction? What are their egg production like? those things all contribute to something called reproductive success. And from an evolutionary point of view, the higher the reproductive success, the better. And so we can compare the reproductive success of these two different morphs and ask how have they changed over time. So when you do that, this is reproductive success from the 1988 to 1990, that early cohort, and then the 1 degree Celsius cohort. And I don't have the 2 degree Celsius cohort up there because they haven't lived long enough yet for us to get an accurate estimate of their reproductive success. When we can get that, we'll add it in. But what you can see is that the metamorph reproductive success has shifted. Pedomorphs have shifted, maybe non-significantly, but they're a lot more similar than they used to be. And in part, that's because some of these life history variables have changed. If you look at the far right, the age at first reproduction has gone down in metamorphs during that time. They're reproducing earlier. And because they're reproducing earlier, there's a trade-off in this population because when you reproduce earlier, you don't live as long. So their longevity went down as well. So we may never catch another 34-year-old salamander. And none of these cohorts may ever reach that age class at all again. Maybe they will, but this suggests that maybe they won't. But those things combine to sort of influence the differences in reproductive success that we're seeing. And they basically shifted these life history variables over time. So their larval growth rates are shifting, metamorphic rates are shifting, and their fitness trade-offs are shifting as well in these populations. And so to sort of pull that all together, these tiger salamanders are shifting their life histories from one adapted to a high elevation site where they live to one that's more similar to low elevation sites. And that's not really that surprising in retrospect because those high elevation sites are becoming more similar to those low elevation sites. And let me just walk you through that. We talked about how high elevation sites have very low energy. You don't have a long growing season. There's not a lot of sunlight, which means there's not a lot of plant growth. The plant growth feeds the invertebrates that they feed on, so there's not a lot to feed on. All those things are true. If you're at lower elevation, you get a longer growing season, you get a lot more energy, you get a lot more food for the salamanders. That means that the salamanders can grow bigger, but we're already seeing increases in the pedomorph growth rates. It also means that pedomorph size tends to be bigger at lower elevations. And we're not quite seeing that yet, but at some point we might see an animal that looks something like that. Sort of like a whole catfish, a two-handed pedomorph, you know? That's what we find at low elevation sites, and so that's the kind of thing we expect to see in the future. But we do know that some of their fitness parameters, the age at first reproduction, is changing in metamorphs, longevity is changing, and that's influencing the relative fitness of pedomorphs to metamorphs. And so we can say that the salamanders are altering their life histories in response to climate change. That's what they're doing. And so if you don't take anything else away from this talk, I want you to remember one thing, and that is that salamanders are not armadillos. Okay? They're just not. They might. Armadillos are climate winners because they can disperse. In the late 1800s, they were found only in a small part of South Texas. And since then, they have expanded throughout the Southeast and throughout the Midwest. When I first arrived at Murray State 28 years ago, there were no armadillos in West Tennessee or Western Kentucky. And now I've got them breeding underneath my porch, digging up my yard, and my dog chases them every night. They're going to be in Pittsburgh. I think I really do. Like, if you look at the latitude they're at right now and go across, I think the only thing keeping them back is maybe lake effect snows or something. I have no idea. But sooner or later, I feel 10 years, 15 years, you're going to be digging armadillos out of your backyard. So hopefully not. But the point is that armadillos can do that because they can disperse really well. And not all species can do that. Whether you disperse or not influences your ability to deal with climate change. Species like these checker spot butterflies, flying insects, northern cardinals are moving up in latitude. Birds are really easy to do that, right? Bowhead whales are changing in latitude because of this. And even humans are shifting, right? We're seeing a lot of climate migrants. They're happy, they can do it, they can disperse. They're trying to go from a place that's not so good to a place that's better because of climate change. But not every species is like that. Trees can't do it. They can't just get up and move. Non-flying insects can't do it. Some species, like polar bears, they can move all they want, but they're running out of habitat. They have nowhere to move to. And our tiger salamanders are kind of like both of those combined, right? They can only move so far up in elevation until they run out of space like polar bears do. And they can move up in latitude, but they can't do it fast enough. They're more like a tree. If you salamanders and trees moved with the last glaciation over 1,000 years. But over decades or 100 years, they can't do it. They just can't do it. So they're not going to be able to do it that way. And when you can't disperse, you adapt. You change. The salamander's life cycle is plastic enough that they're able to shift their life history in real time and change into these organisms that are more adapted to the environment that their environment's becoming. So that's one of the sort of things that you can take from these animals, that they're figuring out a way. So I want to transition from Mexican cut a little bit and talk about other things. Because if you ask, are they climate winners the way armadillos are? No, they're not, because they can't disperse. But they are climate winners in the sense that they are growing faster under higher temperatures, right? So they're doing better. So warming is beneficial for them. And we wanted to find out whether this was ubiquitous and whether we could experimentally induce it. And so we used these experiments at the Hancock Biological Station in Murray. And this was work that I did with Dr. Alicia Lackey, who is a professor at the University of Louisville. And we did this experiment by manipulating the temperatures of half of our tanks with aquarium heaters. So you just throw an aquarium heater in there, and you increase the temperature by 1 degree Celsius. That's it, just one. And then we add these mole salamanders in. They're related to our tiger salamanders. They're smaller. They are found in the southeastern United States, and they're much better for experiments because they mature within a single year. And so we can do these sort of shorter-term experiments and make them work. And we fully expected to see, hey, increased growth, we're going to see all these changes. Temperature is a good thing. Turns out it wasn't a good thing. The ones that were warmed in the orange here on the bottom grew at a slower rate. And so their body mass was lower than the controls that were not that 1 degree higher temperature. We also found that in the females had significantly lower fat mass. And that fat that they store is really important for them producing eggs the next year. When you have less fat, you have less eggs. And when they were warmed, they didn't have more fat, they had less fat. And so that suggests that those two things suggest that, in fact, warming was not beneficial for these salamanders. It was actually a cost. That extra warming, that extra degree, made them metabolize more just to stay around, just to sort of deal with it physiologically. And so they couldn't invest in body growth, and they couldn't invest in fat mass. And in retrospect, one of those hindsight things, right? In retrospect, it makes perfect sense. And the reason is that the air temperatures in Murray, Kentucky are like 90 degrees in the summer, right? The top. And sometimes it gets over 100. And they don't care about humidity, but the humidity's bad too. That means that at that temperature, think about it. I mean, they're ectotherms, but you think about it. At 90 degrees, if you're 1 degree warmer, you want AC. Like, that's what you want. And these animals are no different. They're above their thermal maximum. And so that means that in that case, the temperature is a negative. Whereas in Colorado, you go to Crested Butte, which is thousands of feet lower than Mexican Cut. High temperature is 75. Low temperature in July is 39. You're grabbing a sweatshirt or a jacket or something at night, right? Salamanders are like, give me an extra degree of temperature. I will deal with it. That's fine. And in that case, they're growing more. They're changing their life histories a little bit. But it's beneficial to them from that perspective. And so geography affects how organisms are experiencing and going to respond to climate change. Not just salamanders, but lots of other organisms that we can think of, including human beings, right? None of us are worried about dispersing anywhere just yet. But there's people in the tropics who are being affected a lot more than we are, because they're being affected differently by it than we are. So something to think about. So I think salamanders are really useful for thinking about climate change. When the environment changes, that's influencing who's becoming what morph and how they're growing. It's influencing their fitness consequences. And in the end, that is influencing how they might be changing in response to climate change. And that change that's occurring in Colorado may be very different than the changes that we see in other parts of the world or other kinds of amphibians that are being affected. So if you ask me, which you don't have to because I'm going to tell you, what are salamanders saying? They may not be armadillos, but they are canaries. And maybe we should listen to them. And unlike the salamanders, humans have a choice. We can adapt like salamanders have, or we can do something called mitigation, or we can do both. And I just want to briefly talk about that a little bit, because in sort of when we think about climate change, we think about two alternatives. We can mitigate, which means we try to reduce our carbon dioxide production, or even reduce the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. Or we can say, to heck with that, we're just going to adapt to the new climate. The more we mitigate, the less we have to adapt. The less we mitigate, the more we sort of keep our head in the sand about it, the more adaptation we're going to have to do. And the worse it's going to feel, probably. Now, we know that we're going to have to adapt because climate change is already affecting us with wildfires and storms and all those sorts of things. But the question is how much? And so the more that we mitigate, the better. And what I would like to say to everyone is that everyone on this planet can mitigate in some way if we just keep it in our heads. And I'll give you some examples of how you might be able to do this. If you had asked me 25 years ago whether solar panels were going to work in Pittsburgh, I'd have been like, no, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. A lot of cloudy days, all those sorts of things. This is a home in Munhall owned by two of my favorite people in the audience who have solar panels on their house, and they're getting the electricity benefits of that and the financial benefits of that, but they're also helping to mitigate climate change. And you might say, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to mess with my roof. I don't want to put solar panels. I get that. There are other things you can do. You could also change your transportation to one that is less carbon-based. Get a hybrid, get a plug-in hybrid, get an electric vehicle, which are only as good as where the electricity comes. So maybe you plug that into your solar house, and then you're free of guilt, and you're mitigating completely. But not everyone can afford that, and I understand that. But those are becoming much more affordable. Everyone can walk a little bit more, ride their bikes. Some of you like to do that, I'm sure. That's something you can do. You can also plant trees. And if you can't plant trees, you can pay somebody to do it. You can just donate money for planting trees. Trees are awesome because they help you with mitigation and adaptation. They mitigate because they're carbon filters. They suck up carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. One of the reasons we're in the pickle we're in is because we've deforested the planet. We've taken away our carbon filters. But they also provide shade, which means they can help you adapt and help cities adapt in particular because they're sort of these urban heat sinks. Plants and trees really help with that. Even if you can't do all those things, I hope you can think about climate when you go to the voting booth the next time. Because we all have decisions to make, and currently, the administration and some of the politicians that are in charge think that climate change is a hoax, or that we're all making it up, or that we're all kind of like, a conspiracy theory or something like that. And yet, this is something we should not be fooling around with. This is something that everyone should agree with, that we should find ways to come across the aisle. And I don't care how much you might hate the other side, to shake hands and say, we have to do something on climate. Because this is going to affect all of us, and it doesn't matter whether you're red, white, or blue. It doesn't matter. And I really do wish that my salamanders weren't changing. I wish that I'd never found that salamander and that uppercut. I wish that I could say that everything is just fine there, that there's no problems. And I'm not saying it, I'm not showing you the data because I have some agenda. It's because that's what's happening. I'm a scientist. That's what we do. We went through peer review for these things. Like, we're thinking about this because we're worried about it, but it's also the science that we find. And I always like this quote by Neil deGrasse Tyson, that it doesn't really, the good thing about science is whether it's true, whether you believe in it or not. It's not a belief system. We do it. The people here at Carnegie Science Center are doing it. Like, we're doing it not because we believe a certain thing and we twist it. No, because that's what's happened. The statistics have shown us what's happening. So at a time now when some people are trying to bring back research, reduce the amount of science that's going on in our nation, at a time when we should be expanding science, where we have so much more to do and to learn and to understand. And let me give you an example of that. We need research and education to improve our mitigation, to figure out new technologies so we can mitigate better and more efficiently, and to educate people to use those technologies. Now, this is a gruesomely difficult thing to look at because it's just like spaghetti. But it's a really important point, I think. It shows how solar panels have increased in efficiency since the 1970s. And there's all different kinds of solar panels, and some of them are really research grade. They're not ones you would find on a home in Munhall, for instance. But they vary quite a bit in terms of efficiency. But we've gotten the best ones to 48% efficient. So 48% of the sunlight that hits them is turned into electricity, which is awesome. That's great that we've been able to do that. But that means there's 52% of that energy is still sitting there waiting to be harvested. And think what we could do if we could suck up that last 52% of that energy. It turns out that if you look at the world and you look at 2030 projections of what all power use will be like, it's showing, these squares show the square kilometers of solar panels that would be required to power the world. Take away all the fossil fuels. Don't include windmills. Don't include fuel cells. Don't include nuclear. None of that. Just solar. Those are really big areas, but relative to the size of the planet, those are not very big areas. And they would be smaller areas if we invested in science and technology to increase our efficiency of energy use and to increase the efficiency of those solar panels. Because this is based on 20% efficiency. If we got most solar panels to 40 or 50%, those things shift. If we got it to 90%, those things shift. So I look at it, and people, are very gloom and doom about climate change, and I think that we have options. We can change what's happening. Things are going to happen over the next 100 years that we've put into process right now. They are. And we're not very good at long-term thinking, where humans are very good at short-term thinking, usually 4-year cycles. Sometimes 6, depends on who you are. But we have done so much technologically already, right? Your cell phone is a computer that was stronger than the one that took men to the moon, and we went to the moon, right? We have that technology. When we put our minds to it, when we bring international cooperators together, and we invest in those sorts of things, we can change that. We can restore our climate, not just slow down climate change. We can restore our climate, but we can't do it if we don't have the investment in science. So if you think about what the salamanders are saying, they're saying, stop burning fossil fuels and restore our climate. So I would just like to end by thanking all the people whose coattails I've been hanging on. All the students, all the collaborators, so many of my friends over the years, and those people have come in different age classes. When we started and over the years, what people have looked like. I'm apparently the only person who's ever aged. And then all these organizations that have been involved in my research, including the National Science Foundation, which is taking a hit right now. But without the National Science Foundation, I wouldn't be here being able to speak on a lot of these data. And finally, when someone is doing a study over decades and spending time in Colorado in the summer, all that time, you have to thank the people that are most important to you, which is my family. My kids kind of grew up catching salamanders out in Colorado as part of it. And of all the people in my life who have been supportive, it's my wife who has allowed me to go play with salamanders and do all the things that I do over this time. And without her, none of this would happen. So I would be glad to take any questions. Oh, man.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whiteman. Okay, so we're going to go ahead. We're going to switch into question mode. As a reminder for our online audience, please use the Q&A function in the chat to submit your questions. We'll intersperse those with questions from our live audience. Live audience, please wait until we bring you a microphone, and then please speak into it. So both everyone in this room and everyone at home, as well as Dr. Whiteman, can hear you clearly. Thank you. Okay, looks like we've got a question up there to start. I see someone in the back row.
Check, check.
Hi. The lake where you weren't finding any young salamanders for a while, was it completely freezing over in the winter and killing all of them, or why weren't you finding any?
That's a great question. So the question was, in the pond that I found those salamanders at a higher elevation, why was it that, what was happening in other years that I didn't find them? Here's what I don't know. I suspect that because those animals go up to feed, that some females just had a few extra eggs. And whether they were doing it on purpose or not, they were releasing those eggs in that pond. And they may have been doing that for a long time. But to get to the second year, the ponds have to remain permanent that fall. And a lot of times those ponds will dry up. And it just happened that that year those didn't dry up. And part of the reason they didn't dry up is because the climate's changing maybe, and the hydro period's different, and all those sorts of things. And if we see that more often over time, that's going to sort of solidify that. But I don't know, it could be that they always lay a couple eggs in there. The latest I'm there, though, I mean, I've been there in late August sometimes, and I've never seen hatchlings before. So and I also have colleagues that have studied those ponds that haven't seen hatchlings. So I suspect it's sort of a combination of those two things. Yeah, it's a great question. Right here.
First, let me say.
I'm sorry?
First, let me say, Dr. Whiteman, thank you so much. It was a very interesting presentation.
Well, thank you.
There was one slide that I sort of lost track of where I was or what it was, and it referred to lifetime cannibal densities.
Yeah.
I didn't get the cannibal. Thank you.
I understand why, and I'm sorry about that. That was, I should have explained that part of it. The pedomorphs are cannibalistic. So when it says cannibal, it really means a pedomorph of a certain size, basically. We talk about them as cannibals in that context because they do eat each other. And one of the things that you see in the population is that when you have a lot of cannibals in the population, the animals know it, and there's this thing called ecology of fear. So the larvae tend to slow down their movements and their growth rates because they're not eating as much. They kind of get scared from moving around, and that tends to produce those slow-growing pedomorphs. So you get more pedomorphs when you have those cannibals around. And the other side of that is when you have high snowpack, long, short-growing degree days, or long winters, basically, some of those cannibals die off, and then you get increases in growth rates. Yeah, that's a great question.
I'm going to throw in a question from our online audience.
Sure.
So Chuck at home asks if the data logger data compares to National Weather Service data.
If the data logger data?
I'm sure was from a part where you were maybe discussing how you collect data on your sites.
Oh, it might. I think he might be talking about the increased temperature over time. That's my guess. Is that because that would make the most sense.
Okay.
So that's a good question too. The site where the weather station where we get those data from are actually 1,000 feet lower than Mexican Cut. So the one thing I didn't say is that that's sort of a conservative estimate of what's happening at Mexican Cut. Unfortunately, it may be even worse than that. But that's a U.S. Forest Service snowtail site that we have. They're strewn throughout the Rocky Mountains in Forest Service properties. And those are all online data that you can access through the U.S. Forest Service. I know that, I'm not so sure how those correspond because of where it's positioned, but I know that there are, even 1,000 feet lower at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, there have been significant changes, but they've not been as great as what you find at that snowtail. So the National Weather Service data that come from Crested Butte, for instance, would not show those same changes because that's another 1,000 feet lower. And so it's just, I don't know that if the National Weather Service had a weather station, they wanted to put it up at Mexican Cut, I would be glad to have it. So if he knows somebody, that'd be great.
All right, thank you. And Chuck also says, great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck.
Looks like we have a question here in the auditorium.
Hi.
Hi.
Is there an advantage to the species to have more of one morph than the other at any given time?
That's a good question. The thing about evolution is it doesn't really work on the level of species, so it doesn't necessarily matter. But from a like a management point of view, it could matter. And I don't know. I mean, they do sort of. There are more frequencies across populations seem to change based on what's happening in the pond, how permanent it is, and what's happening outside the pond. I will say this, that the metamorphs, there's sort of an interesting thing about these populations that, let's say that things got so bad that the pedomorphs just left. There were just no more pedomorphs. But the metamorphs were still able to coexist. There's always the potential with a metamorph that it'll come back to a pond, lay some eggs, conditions will change, and the pedomorphs can come back. But you can't do it the other way necessarily. So if the ponds all dry up, the pedomorphs are gone, but if they refill again, you can bring back the pedomorphic form, if that makes sense. So in some ways, from a management point of view, the metamorphs are almost better. You know, I don't have favorites, but yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and throw in another question from our online audience. One of our attendees asks, can the salamanders that have the horse pill-sized tracker sewn into them still mate successfully?
Yes, have mate.
Can they still
I'm
mate
sorry. Can
successfully?
the animals that have the data loggers in them, are they able to mate successfully? I'm just racking my brain trying to remember. I'm pretty sure. The males certainly can because nothing really stops a male. The females, I'm pretty sure that at least one of the animals that we've recaptured, when we caught her, it was one of those things where we caught her and she had eggs, and we're like, we're not taking the data logger out until she releases the eggs. So I think we ended up letting her go, and somehow we caught her again, or maybe we haven't. I don't know. But I mean, she came back with a full thing of eggs, so presumably they're able to do it. There's no evidence that they can't. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
In one of the early charts, you showed the temperature increase from the 1940s through the present, roughly. And in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it was fairly stable. And starting in the 80s, it took off to the present. Do you have a theory as to why there's been such a dramatic increase in world temperature from the 80s on?
That's a good question. I'm not a climatologist, so I'm not really sure. So the question was whether there was a real shift in the 1980s where the temperature seems to spike up or start to spike up then. What was happening then and what was different about that? And that's a really good question. I can't think of anything in particular except that maybe there's been, because of sort of development in, I don't want to blame any countries, but if you think about development in China, that may have ramped up in the 1980s. And India, that's right, yeah. So those things definitely could, I don't know that, but that's a reasonable hypothesis for why it might be happening, yeah. There's one over here, yeah.
While we wait for the mic to make it to the other side here, I'm going to go ahead and give us another question from online.
Okay.
Rick asks, how do fairy shrimp respond to higher temperatures? Increased population size or individual size?
Fairy shrimp.
Yes.
Wow, somebody knows something about it. I want to know who that person is. So that's a good question. I don't necessarily know the answer to that. We have monitored fairy shrimp populations in the lower, in both of those things, but not consistently. There's only so much we can do in a sense. And I have collaborators who work on the invertebrates and have done an amazing job over the expanse of time doing that. And so we have sort of snippets of that, but I don't know that we've ever looked. So that's a really good question, and that's something, because those fairy shrimp are really critical to the metamorphs, it turns out. So that's a great question, something to think about.
Hi, I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
First one, that high mortality rate of the first year salamanders.
Yes.
Is it because of the cannibalism, or is it a different reason for them to die early?
Why do they sometimes have a high mortality rate?
Yeah.
Yeah, because Yes, because especially during years where there are a lot of those cannibalistic pedomorphs, the hatchlings are basically like popcorn for them. They just pop them, yeah.
And second question, do you compare humans to salamanders? Do you see any ways how humanity tries to adapt to the temperature rising, maybe birth rate dropping? Is our way to adjust? Thank you, sir.
Well, that's a really good question. Let's see, how do I do that without not getting myself in trouble? If you didn't hear, the question is whether humans could adapt in that way, in that same sort of way. I think it would not surprise me. We're not as plastic as amphibians, and our generation times are much longer as well. So we can't plastically adapt as quickly as they can. And so I think our strategy is really dispersal and using our brains to sort of adapt our environment or our expectations of that environment so that we can make it work for us. Now that being said, there are sort of like shifts in reproduction and things like that that occur across latitude in human populations. And so it could be that given those shifts in latitude, it could be that if any of that is temperature dependent, then those changes in temperatures could also shift what's going on with us. But I'm not sure that's working in a positive way. So I'm not really sure. Yeah. Wish I knew the answer to that question.
Okay, we've got another question here from our online audience. One of our attendees asks, can armadillos outcompete ground squirrels? Or will ground squirrels disperse to the northern territories?
I think I would have to call my wife, who's a mammologist, to answer that question. Can armadillos outcompete ground squirrels? I don't know. I don't know. Armadillos, I don't know if they're actually competing for anything, is the thing. They're just using some of the same habitats. Armadillos seem very benign in terms of like what they do ecologically. In fact, they create burrows which might be beneficial for ground squirrels. You get an old armadillo burrow and then maybe something uses it. I'm not a pro armadillo guy, don't get me wrong, but I don't think there's really any competition that would occur, especially because of the differences in what they eat. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess next time we'll have to get a pro armadillo guy in here.
Yeah. No, I agree. Somebody knows what they're talking about.
Okay, looks like we're bringing the mic to another online or another auditorium audience member.
You had mentioned NSF as a funding source.
Yes.
Is that your primary funding source, or are there other funding sources?
That's a great question. It was about whether NSF is my primary funding source. NSF is not, like I don't continuously have an NSF grant. I'm not that good. But I have had multiple grants over that period of time, including starting when I was a graduate student. I had what was called a dissertation improvement grant. And then we've had several reasonably large grants that would get us sort of 5 years, maybe we could stretch it to 6 years, in different places. And then we recently had a short-term sort of 2-year grant that some collaborators and I worked on that we're hoping to build off of. So no, and in between, there's sort of like you think about bridge funding. I've been very lucky that the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory has these fellowship monies that has allowed me to get by with sort of a skeleton crew. And we've also had, that's been very important to my research, the National Science Foundation has what's called a research experience for undergraduates program, which is all about undergraduates that come in from all over the country, many of which who would otherwise not have that experience. And they work with somebody like me, and so they're able to work at Mexican Cut with me and help us in what we're doing, and they're creating an independent project that can hopefully springboard them to like greater things like graduate school or whatever it happens to be in science. And that is unfortunately one of those programs that we're worried about because it has, in the past, it's had a diversity component to it. So yeah, NSF has been critical to what I've been doing, but there's been times where we've had to piece together other parts of it, yeah, the puzzle. Sure, thank you very much.
It was a really nice talk. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
So I have a question about genetics, actually. So like,
Oh, boy.
you know, in the life history of any one individual, there's probably going to be a point, or it'd be a go, no-go point to either become a sexually mature pedomorph or mature into a metamorph. Like what genetic mechanism allows that point to happen? Or is it like gene regulation? Is it different alleles of some critical genes?
It's very likely that, yeah, so the question was what are the genetics underlying these animals? And we don't know exactly. I have a colleague at the University of Kentucky who probably knows a lot more about this than I do and could probably point to some of the genes. But in our system, in our exact system, we don't know for sure. But we do know in work that was done in mole salamanders, the one I did the experiment on, that there are multiple genes that are interacting. And when they're turned on and when they're turned off, I'm not so sure that I know for sure exactly what that's happening. But we know that the numbers of those multiple genes that you have to do with propensity to metamorphose or become pedomorphic. And the one thing I should mention, just to be clear about it, you might have noticed in the life cycle that some of the pedomorphs were switching over to metamorphs later. There's a little arrow there. And so there's probably some gene regulation there. That's another thing. I didn't have time to talk about that, but when I started, that didn't happen all that often. You know, it was a very low percentage of the population. Maybe less than 2% of the population was doing that. And it happened when animals had a growth spurt, like when they were 9 years old or something. So if they lived long enough, some of them would end up doing that. There's very few individuals that do it. Until the last 5 years, when it's doubled. And I think that part of the reasons it's doubled is the same reason that the pedomorph growth rates have gone up, that they are experiencing a different environment. It's warmer, they're getting more energy, longer growing seed. All those things are influencing animals that would otherwise have not metamorphosed into metamorphosing. It's still a very small percentage, but I'm sure there's some gene regulation going on in there. And yeah, that's part of my hope that we can figure that out. It's a great question. Thank you. Anything?
Oh, it looks like we've got a couple more that just came in from online here.
Okay.
So we have another question about your funding. One of our attendees asks, who invests in your endowment? Is there federal funding involved?
I'm sorry, who invests in what?
In your endowment, is there federal funding involved?
Oh, in the, like the endowed chair position, I guess?
The question just says, who invests in your endowment? That is a good guess?
No, I don't have an endowment right now, but if they would like to start one for me, I would be very happy. We can even call it their name, Salamander Endowment. That'd be fine. I have no problem with that. I mean, the chair position I have is endowed by the state, and so it's one of the state things. Yeah.
Okay, that may be what they're asking about.
Yeah.
Another question.
Not federal.
Not federal. Okay. Another question from online. An attendee asks, can we make hybrid salamanders in a lab to combat the climate change challenges?
Oh, man. Yes, we could. Yes, we could. We could do that. I don't want to do that. We get in trouble when we do that. Like, it's, you know what I mean? Like, I've come around a lot on, like, transgenic organisms. We're all eating them now in our corn chips, like, all the corn that goes into those things is transgenic, genetically engineered. And so I think we need to be really careful about that. Now, we could do crosses and all those sorts of things too, but I think they're doing just fine. These salamanders actually are doing a lot better than lots of other species are. Yeah, they're gonna run out of room migrating this way, but they're gonna shift their life histories. And my guess is that the biggest problem for them is what we talked about earlier, is that the ponds might shrink. And that's going to be the thing that's going to affect them more than anything, because I think they're able to really make a difference from a life history point of view. Yeah.
So speaking of that part, I heard recently that the eastern side of the Rockies in Colorado has gotten a lot less snow this winter than usual. Is that going to affect your area? Do you know?
That's a good question. Whether the east side of the Rockies getting less snow is going to have any effect. We're actually on the west side, and the kind of cool thing about where Mexican Cut sits is that it's actually the wettest part of Colorado. So we get, it's just tremendous snowfall there. And it's sort of another reason why many years those ponds don't melt out until July 4th. It's because of the snowpack. Like there's just so much snow. And so I don't think that that's necessarily going to affect it. That being said, I have a friend who lives out at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab in the winter, Billy Barr, who you should Google him and look at his YouTube videos. He's fantastic. He keeps weather for the station, and they haven't had a lot of snow there either this year. So I don't know what it's like at Mexican Cut, honestly, but typically we get more than RMBL does, so hopefully it's going to be okay.
The polar regions are getting warmer a lot faster than the mid-latitudes here.
Yeah.
Is anyone in Canada doing some similar research on any native species there that you know of, or?
I think there are a lot of people who are doing research. So the question is, at these high latitude sites that are sort of changing in the same way that our mountain sites are changing, who's doing research or what's going on? I've had some colleagues that have worked on wood frogs, which actually there are wood frogs in Alaska, which you wouldn't think there's any frogs in Alaska, but they are, and they freeze solid. They do all kinds of cool things. So they're doing really neat things that way. And there's probably a lot of research going on caribou and on the seals that are up there. You know, the polar bears, obviously, a lot of species that are there. And I should actually do a plug, too, for there's my collaborator, Kelsey Ryder, not high latitude, but she works in the Andes, which are like 20,000 feet. So imagine what I do, except double it. And that's what she does. And she was studying this. She helped the film crew for the America series that Tom Hanks is doing right now. And so if you watch that series, you're going to see a frog that functionally freezes every day. Like every night it dies functionally, freezes solid, and then it wakes up the next day and right? And so there's a good question about what happens when climate change reaches those animals that are so adapted to that crazy environment at 22,000 feet or whatever it is. Yeah.
Okay, we've got another question from our online audiences. Chuck asks if these salamanders have had their genomes sequenced.
Yes, yeah, but mostly. You know, that's another question my friend Randall Voss at the University of Kentucky could operate, and you could Google him, Chuck, and see what you think. But a lot of the genome has been sequenced. I think a lot of axolotl genome has been sequenced. I don't know that mine has. Although, yeah. The thing about salamanders, the problem with genome sequencing of salamanders is that their genomes are actually huge compared to the rest of us. They have all this, I think all this junk DNA in there along with, and for whatever reason, and so that makes it kind of difficult to do some of those things, I think, but I'm not a geneticist, so yeah. It's a good question, though.
Another one of our online attendees asks if Mexican Cut is going to be renamed America Cut.
I know the answer to that one. The answer is no.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions
That's a good question.
from our on-site audiences here? Not seeing any hands. Going once. Going twice.
I think we're good.
Okay, it looks like we have wrapped up all our questions. So I'm going to hop back up here real quickly. Let's give Dr. Howard Whiteman another big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you to all of you, our wonderful and very dedicated Cafe Sci attendees, as well as to our online audience. I'll just remind everybody that tonight's presentation, along with all Cafe Sci recordings, will be available on the Carnegie Science Center's YouTube channel. Check in about a week. That's usually when we can get the recordings up. This would be the part where typically I remind you to tune in next month, but I'm going to drop some special reminders on y'all. As this was our second February Cafe Sci presentation, there will not be a March Cafe Sci presentation. However, we really hope that all of you are going to tune back in / be here on site to join us for a particularly exciting Cafe Sci in April. Slight date change, Wednesday, April 9th. Don't worry, we'll be advertising this. We will be hosting Nobel Prize for Physics winner Dr. William Phillips as part of the Pittsburgh Quantum Institute's annual conference. We expect that to be a packed house. So it's going to be a little different than our normal Cafe Sci. Again, Dr. Whiteman, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you, and we hope you've enjoyed our presentation. Have a great night.